Hello and welcome to the 2025 MIFF Schools program. I'm Josh Nelson, and on behalf of all of the team at MIFF, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all live, learn and work, and to pay our respects to their elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Here at MIFF, we continue to celebrate the history and contemporary creativity of the world's oldest living culture. As those of you familiar with the MIFF Schools programs from previous years will no doubt already be aware, these presentations have been created as an educational resource for teachers and students, providing an overview of each film text, suggesting strategies for analysis and topics for classroom discussion, and tying together aspects from the films to the various assessment criteria found within the language courses offered under VCAR, and also to subjects such as English and EAL, literature, media studies, and the film study course for the International Baccalaureate. In each of those curriculums, there's a real key focus on developing students' visual literacy skills and encouraging students to critically engage with media texts across a range of contexts and mediums. And this obviously becomes a really key component of assessment as students progress into their final years of the VCE. So for that reason, film analysis will be a key focus of these presentations, not as a replacement or as a substitute for the focus on language and cultural aspects, but rather as something that can sit side by side those key focus areas. While the MIFF Schools program is perhaps ideally suited to students within the French, Japanese, Mandarin, Italian, German and English language courses, the selected films in this year's program offer opportunities for study and classroom analysis across a really diverse range of subjects, abilities and age groups, preparing students, as I mentioned, for those text-based assessments and really developing those visual literacy skills. Now, I'm going to focus on the film techniques and terminologies that students would ideally have a familiarity with in just a moment. But before I do that, here a brief synopsis of the film might be useful. Now, I should mention this will be a relatively spoiler-free presentation. I'm going to avoid, as much as possible, giving away any crucial plot details or revelations within the films themselves, while still providing you with an overview of the content of the film and suggesting some strategies and suggestions for analysis that should really help structure that post-screening and pre-screening classroom discussion and context. An Urban Allegory is a French-language short film exploring the Greek philosopher Plato's Allegory of the Cave, as posited in his work Republic from around 375 BC, but now reimagined in the urban sprawl of modern-day Paris, and centering around an aspiring dancer and her young son. Co-directed by Alice Rohrwacher, whose acclaimed feature La Chimera screened at MIFF in 2023, and multimedia artist JR, An Urban Allegory is a visually stunning work, inspired by a work produced in collaboration with the Paris Opera and featuring music by Thomas Bangalter, half of Daft Punk, not to mention a cameo from legendary French auteur Leo Carache, which sets about pushing Plato's ideas about the realities of the world as we perceive them into new and potentially revolutionary terrain. But before we look at this film in more detail, I do want to return to the terminology and techniques that I flagged at the beginning of the presentation, and that real core focus on developing students' visual literacy skills. And so I would actually recommend to teachers that prior to attending the screening, it might be really useful to either introduce, depending on the age level of the students, or at least revise a selection of key film terminology and techniques that students should really be thinking about while they're watching the film. Because, and I realize I say this every year, it's crucially important to reinforce the need for students to actively engage with these films. Yes, they're entertaining. Yes, films are fun. But there also needs to be that expectation placed upon students that they'll be watching these films in order to analyze them. whether that's as part of a non-English language course or English, EAL, media, or a film studies unit. And on that, I would actually suggest that students take notes or be encouraged to take notes during the screening. It's one way to ensure that they're going to be actively engaging with what they're seeing on screen. Now, I'll talk about some of these elements in relation to the specific film in more detail shortly, but just as a general overview of film techniques, something that might be beneficial prior to the screening, this might be a useful starting point. And look, there's no shortage of film resources online that can assist in that process, whether that's on YouTube or in, say, textbook form. I would also really emphasize from the outset that it's important that students can firstly identify the technique that's being used, that secondly, they can understand its general function in the context of film language and filmmaking, especially in terms of creating meaning within the film itself from a filmmaker's perspective. And then thirdly, that they can apply that knowledge to an analysis of the specific text in the context of the narrative, the characters, the themes and ideas that the film's exploring. And it's very difficult to achieve that final outcome unless those first two learning aims have been properly established and understood. And so with that in mind, some of the basic techniques that students should ideally be familiar with are things like cinematography, whether that's the close-up or a wide-angle shot or camera movement, the various components of mise-en-scène, which incorporates elements such as props, costumes, the use of lighting, the blocking of actors, the composition of the frame, where relevant, music and also lyrics, sound, dialogue, the use of voiceover, editing, narrative structure and story elements, and also visual motifs and symbolism. And so, as I mentioned, these are effectively the building blocks of filmmaking. So it's really essential, I think, that students have an awareness of these and come into the screenings with that awareness. Okay, so moving on to look at the film in a little more detail here. So some of the key themes explored within an urban allegory are obviously Plato's Allegory of the Cave, which I'll touch on in more detail shortly, art and representation, dance, performance, sort of more generally, generational differences, the city, reality and perception, the idea of community, and also revolution sort of comes in towards the latter stages of the film. When I approach a film, whether it's a feature film or a short film, I think it's always really useful, depending on the age and academic level of the students, to try and place it in a bigger context. Give students that bigger picture of understanding. Here, there are a number of elements within the film where I think you could contextualize this film. Obviously, Plato's Allegory of the Cave feels like an important context to give students, even prior to watching the film. So, the film is obviously inspired by the Greek philosopher Plato's Allegory of the Cave, which is reimagined within this urban setting. So students would benefit from having a familiarity with Plato's allegory or his ideas more generally, but also some of the other key creative figures involved with the production, both in front of the camera, such as the French auteur Léos Carax, who cameos as a director within the film, or the film's directors, Alice Rohrwacher and J.R., and also the performance of Chiroptera that features throughout this film. And I've provided a link to a number of these wider contexts. So obviously the link to the film's page on Wikipedia, there are some links to interviews and other sort of production materials within that. The link to the Allegory of the Cave is obviously important. I have listed links to both of the key artistic figures in the directors of Alice Rohrwacher and J.R. I think having an understanding of or an awareness of some of their earlier projects may deepen students' understanding of where they're coming from for this film. But also, even, like the cameos for Léos Carax, or the influence of a figure like Thomas Bangalter and the way his music comes into play within this film. And what I would suggest either prior to or certainly afterwards would be to show students the performance of Chiroptera, which is online You can watch it online. It's there on YouTube. I think it only goes for around 20-25 minutes. And that performance is obviously a really key influence and feature of an urban allegory. So these are all avenues or contexts, I think, that you could draw upon to broaden and deepen students' understandings of the viewing of the film. So production background is obviously key here. And I think interviews, particularly with the directors, Rohrwacher and JR, would further enhance students' understandings of the creative process behind filmmaking, and in particular, their creative intentions for this film. And I've listed a couple of references to interviews with the pair, and also to the film's press kit, which you'll notice has a rather cumbersome link. There's a link via the film's Wikipedia page, which is easily accessible. But as Rohrwacher and JR suggest, what lies behind the daily movement of a city? Last winter we met in Paris and began discussing the allegory of the cave as told in Plato's Republic. The myth imagines humanity living in chains, facing the back of a cave and watching shadows move on the walls, thinking it's reality. We both work with images, which certainly can be illusions, but can also become instruments of struggle and liberation of thought. So from this discussion, we decided to create a short film. We had a few fixed ideas: the cave, the dance, the city bustling around us, and one question: what would happen if we all managed to turn together towards the exit of the cave? Perhaps it's not enough to assert that images are illusions, as long as the chains that bind us are real. An ideal window into the film and an ideal prompt to ask students to consider what the directors mean by that in respect of the film, having watched the film, ideally. There are also considerations regarding form and style, given that this is a short film. So students should consider the following kinds of questions. What are some of the characteristics of a short film format that differentiate it from feature-length filmmaking? The sort of rejection of wholesale psychological transformation that we often see in feature filmmaking, or the imperative to provide a kind of psychological background or justification or history for certain characters, which is very much a kind of key element of certain mainstream Hollywood filmmaking approaches to narrative filmmaking. Asking students to consider what subjects might be best suited to a short film, or even asking students to consider why the filmmakers might have chosen to present this particular exploration of Plato's allegory in a short film format as opposed to a feature-length production. How would the film's focus differ in a feature-length context? Would it sustain that same kind of length of narrative, perhaps? There's a quote from Kenneth Branagh that gets shopped around quite a lot, where he's quoted as saying, "I think that short films often contain an originality, a creative freedom, an energy and an invention that is inspiring and entertaining. I think they are, as Shakespeare would put it, a good deed in a naughty world." I think that's an ideal prompt for students to consider in relation to this or any other short films that you could show them in that classroom context. Regardless of whether it's short film or feature, film techniques, the building blocks of cinema and the language of cinema remains the same. So students really need to be mindful of how this film employs various cinematic techniques, whether it's certain types of shots, the use of focus, the use of composition, and how each of these shapes our connection to the images on screen. So, for example, recognizing the technique of a close-up, identifying that technique, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, having an awareness of its basic function in the form of cinema, creating that emotional connection or that identification between character and audience, highlighting key details within the frame. These are its general functions, but then taking that one step further. What is the particular function of a close-up in this moment within the film, or in this context of the film, or across the film more broadly? How are the directors using the close-up in this particular example? So that 1, 2, 3 stage process is really key. So wide-angle shot. Why does the film open with a wide-angle shot, giving us the expanse of the city, and then moving into the intimate world of the characters within that? Why use a high-angle shot to represent the people in the city. So typically, a high-angle shot where the camera looks down diminishes the status of those individuals within the frame. And this is how the filmmakers have chosen to introduce the citizens of Paris. Conversely, when you use a low-angle shot, shooting subjects from beneath looking up, tends to exaggerate their status. It empowers them in a way. So here we have the counterpoint to that, which is the low-angle shot that we get towards the end of this film, asking students to consider the contrast between these two techniques, the opening use of high angles and this low angle that we get towards the end. And there are other techniques that students could analyze in more detail. The use of lighting, the use of shadow, obviously connects us very directly to the ideas contained within Plato's Allegory, or the use of animation and sort of stop motion animation using JR's photographic images on the side of these buildings and walls around Paris. So, a key focal point and the context that I've mentioned a couple of times. I'm not going to give you the entire rundown of Plato's Allegory of the Cave. I have placed a link there to Plato's work via the Harvard link that's free to read online. You could introduce that in a classroom context without any problem. Let me give you the Cliff Notes version, and I have a kind of personal connection to Plato's Allegory of the Cave, having co-hosted a film show for many years with former MIFF alumni Thomas Caldwell on Melbourne community radio station 3RRR called Plato's Cave. And you will understand the connection between film and Plato's Cave in just a moment if you're not familiar with the allegory. Basically, imagine a group of prisoners chained facing the back of a cave wall. This is the only existence they've ever known. And they see shadows projected, which are the result of people walking backwards and forwards in front of a fire towards the front of the cave. And the noises that they hear as these images are being projected, they associate with the shadows themselves. And then Plato imagines what would happen if one of the prisoners got free and found themselves at the entrance to the cave and managed to escape and saw sunlight for the first time. And at first it would be blinding and painful. And then eventually their eyes would adjust and they would realize there was a reality outside the cave, and that the images that the prisoners had been watching for this whole time weren't in fact reality, but were in fact shadows. And then Plato postulates what would happen if the prisoner returned to the cave to tell the other prisoners what he or she had seen. Would they laugh at him? Would they reject this idea of there being another reality outside of the one in which they've become familiar? So he's playing with these ideas about perception and reality. I won't go into notions of Platonic ideals and Platonic forms. We'll hold that off until the kids get to university. The Cliff Notes version, I think, that students should be familiar with, or understand at least, perhaps, is that the human prisoners mistake the shadows on the wall for reality. That the revelation of the truth, i.e. the sun and the outside world, can be a painful experience, and that convincing others of a higher truth or a reality can be met with condescension and rejection. So, having established the kind of basic tenets of Plato's Allegory of the Cave, I think students should consider the relevance of Plato's ideas in a contemporary social, cultural, historical, or political context, especially relevant now in an age that's dominated by questions regarding the media. For example, truth in journalism, truth in politics. Do you remember that? Cough, cough. Notions of virtual reality, the ongoing rise of AI, in which these questions about authenticity and believing what we see are becoming increasingly prevalent. Now, I've used Plato's Allegory of the Cave as a teaching tool for films like The Truman Show or The Matrix. These are films that are clearly indebted to Platonic ideas and his allegory of the cave. But Rohrwacher and JR's approach differ slightly, setting it outside the kind of generic framework of a sort of science fiction narrative. This is a very different type of film, as Rohrwacher explains in that interview for That Shelf. She says, in the Allegory of the Cave, Plato imagined humanity stuck in a cave with chains that made it impossible for them to move their heads, so they just look in front of themselves. They see shadows and they think this is reality. But the cave of Plato can be everywhere where there is a man who thinks, I'm right, this is the only possibility, this is the reality, it's just in front of me. I would also suggest or put to students, what does Plato's Allegory remind us of? The experience of watching a film. We're all seated looking at a screen in which images are being projected from behind us. We're all facing, for the most part, the same direction. Those of us who aren't looking at our phones. Boo, earns. So, Plato kind of imagines or preempts the cinematic apparatus through the allegory of the cave in 375 BC. So this is obviously a really foundational kind of work of philosophy for questions about art and representation, and cinema especially. So one of the key themes that comes through in this film is that of reality. And I would ask students to consider, in what ways does the film explore or set out to challenge our notions regarding everyday reality? How does the film present these ideas to the audience within the frame of the film? What's the relationship between images and reality within the frame of the narrative? Or even between art and reality? Is reality merely a question of perspective or seeing? Again, an interesting alternative perspective or insight from the director. If the cave is, for example, in Paris, we should not see it. It's hidden behind the images of the cities, hidden in some part. The art of JR is mostly about covering the reality with big pictures, big images. A big part of this work is to put something on top of reality to change our perspective on that reality. An ideal prompt. How does the film present that idea to the audience? Did that idea come through for the students? Another key motif, photography, and this links us back to the role of JR within this film. What role does photography, or more broadly, the printed image, play within the film? How does the decision to employ physical images laid on top of the cityscape, as opposed to using visual effects or computer-generated imagery, alter our relationship to the film, to the characters, to the ideas that are being explored? Why, perhaps, is it significant that the photographic images are in black and white? So what is that tension between colour and black and white in terms of these ideas about reality and authenticity, for example? There are a number of prompts, I think, in terms of the way this film uses that motif of photography. And JR brings an interesting perspective to that, where he says, we wanted the audience to feel the texture of the paper, the imperfections of things, and the fact that we are trying to tell a story from the perspective of a child, but it also comes from our inner child. A key focus within this film is obviously that of the city. So in what ways does an urban allegory challenge our perceptions or our understandings of the urban city space, or Paris specifically? How is the city presented initially compared to at the end of the film? Does the film suggest a kind of resurrection or a sense of community that comes from people having their perceptions of reality and that setting challenged? Does the film's vision of Paris presented in this film differ from how the city is often or typically presented on screen? Think about the kind of connotations of Paris, the city of love, as it's represented repeatedly, certainly in American cinema. Does this film sort of de-romanticize Paris in a way? How does it differ? How is this not the kind of typical Parisian film? Again, JR. When you look at the work of Christo and Jean-Claude, who were wrapping up bridges and buildings, or the Arc de Triomphe, you look at it differently. Even when they remove their work, you never forget that for a moment they allowed you to re-look at it from a different perspective. That shows you in a very beautiful and ambitious way that you can do with everything in life, a relationship or a city or context or community. Another ideal prompt. And ideally you would show them examples of Christo or Jean-Claude's work to reinforce the association that he's making there. So the motif of dance, and this dance performance that we come to at various points within the film. What role does the dance / opera / music play in the film? What parallels might the filmmakers be suggesting between these and cinema as respective art forms? What role does the body play within the film, or indeed within Plato's Allegory? How does the footage of Chiroptera and the bodies of the performers bring to mind aspects or ideas from Plato's Allegory of the cave? What role do the dance sequences occupy within this film's wider approach to questions about reality and representation. Thinking about scale, thinking about costume, thinking about lighting, thinking about the impact of music, thinking about movement in these performance sequences. And again, as I mentioned earlier on in the presentation, the performance is available to watch online, and I would again recommend students do that either prior to or certainly after their viewing of this film. A nice little motif, again, that taps back into these themes about perspective and reality and how we see the world. The young child in the film holds a kaleidoscope early on. So what's the symbolic importance of the kaleidoscope? In what ways does it connect to these various themes and ideas that we've been talking about? Why might the filmmaker have chosen to associate this item specifically with a child character? What might the film be saying about the ways in which adults and children see the world differently? And without giving anything away about the ending, what impressions do Rohrwacher and JR leave the audience with at the end of the film? What's the tone of the ending? Is there a sense of resolution? How have our understandings of the characters or the ideas presented in the film been changed by the ending? And again, I say this in all the presentations, it's really important to impress upon students the need for them to come up with a range of possible interpretations in their response to the film. That there is no necessarily one right or wrong way of interpreting a film, so long as they can justify it based on what they've seen on the screen. That's the key. And as Rohrwacher says, when you make a movie, you always have to give the possibility to see from another perspective. Our desire is for people to see the movie and then talk what images are instruments of freedom and which are chains. It's not sufficient to say images are illusions, since chains are real. Another perfect prompt for classroom discussion. And finally, in terms of assessment and utilising the kind of terms and terminologies and critical strategies for analysis within one task, I think the review is an ideal form. So really, students could be tasked with reading and critically engaging with other published reviews of the film, and then respond by writing their own. And for French language classes, for example, that could be writing it in French. The key thing, I think, is having the students draw on their close analysis of the film with some of the issues that I've just touched on, but more importantly, utilising the kinds of terminology that I've outlined or introduced within the presentation. And here's an example of a review of the film by Marco Tassini from The Edge mag, and I've listed the link there. And as Tassini writes, Rohrwacher and JR's interpretation of the Platonic myth extends beyond the individual quest for enlightenment to a social and communal dimension. They propose that no one can achieve salvation in isolation. To ignite even a flicker of revolution, it's essential to spread the flame of understanding and share the insights gained from breaking free of the metaphorical cave. An urban allegory is an adept synthesis of Rohrwacher and JR's artistic philosophies. Their film reflects a humanistic approach to cinema and art, placing a high value on both individual and collective human experiences. By integrating different methods to convey their shared vision, they underscore the notion that art should not be elitist, but rather accessible to communities. This approach transforms art from a tool of exploitation to a means of active engagement and creative expression. The film emerges as an urban fairy tale, rich with Rohrwacher's characteristic symbolism and allegory. If you were critically engaging with reviews of the film, I think that review in particular serves as an ideal prompt for further discussion and debate amongst the students. Is that how they saw it? Do they understand what Tassini's getting at? There's a lot in there, I think, to unpack, not just in the reviews and the response to the film, but obviously in the film itself. And with that, we have reached the end of the presentation. For information regarding bookings, age suitability, or additional details for all of the films in this year's MIFF Schools program, head on over to miff.com.au/schools, where you will find all the information and resources, as well as links to the rest of this year's festival program and screenings. And so, on behalf of myself, Josh Nelson, and MIFF Schools programmer Kate Fitzpatrick, we'd like to thank you for watching this presentation and to wish you a very enjoyable and, more importantly, educationally rewarding experience at this year's film festival. Thanks so much.